Well, today marks the 100th anniversary of the armistice that ended the First World War in 1918. Journalists have played a crucial role in reporting conflict since World War I and continue to do so today.
Well, earlier I spoke to Alex Tarquinio, the president of the Society of Professional Journalists in the United States. She's in Paris as part of those centenary events. Now, I began by asking her to reflect on the role reporters played in conflict over the past century.
They played a hugely important role, and in every war since the armistice as well. They are in the field. They are unarmed. They are there with a notebook, a pencil, or a camera. They're documenting what they see. There are so many things, both good and bad, that we would not know over the wars of the last century if the reporters had not been there, both atrocities and also heroism. So they play a very important role, and they are out there on the front line unarmed. So we have to thank them at this time on the armistice, and not just any armistice, the centennial of the end of the First World War. We have to stop and appreciate what the journalists have done.
And in particular, the conflict of World War I, how difficult was it for reporters to operate?
It was, and it was also increasingly a war where civilians were at risk up until that point, and early in the war, it was more in the traditional sense of young men who were trained in combat going out into the field, and it obviously the civilians were increasingly at risk as it went along, not to the extent they were in World War II, but the journalists were also there documenting that. So that was another very important thing that journalists did, beginning with World War I and then increasingly over the last century.
And certainly since then, when reporters have worked in conflict zones, it has been very hazardous work, and that still applies today, of course.
Yes, as a matter of fact, recently the UN held their Day to End Impunity, which is now an annual tradition on November 2nd, as of the last 5 years, to pursue the killers of journalists. And in this year, they showed a documentary about Chris Hondros, the American journalist who was killed in combat. And it was very moving. You saw not only what he had documented over the years in many conflicts over the past 20 years, but what documentarians did is they went and they found some of the people who were in his photographs and what had happened to their life since he had taken those photographs. And these are stories we would not have known about if he had not been there, Chris Hondros. So it was yet another reminder that journalists continue to fill those roles today.
And Alex, the Reporters Without Borders wants to establish democratic guarantees for the global information and communication space. Just explain that to us.
Yes, it's a hugely important initiative that they started a couple of months ago, and they have announced on a pre-announcement this week, but they are formally announcing it tomorrow. Well, actually today in Australia on Armistice Day. And it is part of a larger peace forum that is opening here in Paris on November 11th. And what they have done is they've gathered many big thinkers, Nobel laureates, former heads of state, high-level journalists, and thought leaders, really, in their fields, who, for the past 2 months, have been debating the challenges of freedom of information globally. And what they've recognized, this is also, in addition to being the centennial of the armistice that ended World War I, it is also the 70th anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights, which was also here in Paris. So they have decided that as part of that the next iteration of that, we need to focus on freedom of information and new threats, which have really just emerged really in the past decade because of the evolving technologies to that freedom of information. So they looked at things such as threats on the internet, threats from false information spreading virally online, and those sorts of things, and have tried to come up with some standards or some ways a framework really to work with that.
Yes, it underlines the difficulty of reporting in many countries, particularly under repressive regimes.
Yes. Repressive regimes, but also democracies. There have been increasing threats in liberal democracies. More from rhetoric. And last time we spoke, we talked about Trump's rhetoric of fake news, but it isn't only him. There are many democracies, for example, in Eastern Europe, where the leaders are adopting similar rhetoric. Largely because it's easier for them to do so now. They can use the tools of the internet, the tools of social media to bypass or circumvent the traditional press and get their message out directly to the people unfiltered. And there are aspects of that are good, especially in repressive democracies, when people who are challenging the authoritarian regimes have used these tools in that way. But it is a little disconcerting when elected officials are circumventing the media to give messages that may not be entirely truthful, or may just be their own take, shall we say, on issues, and they want to get that message out unchallenged.
Yeah, bluntly, are you talking about the presidency of Donald Trump, Alex? Particularly, we've seen another example this past week, and I noticed that the Reporters Without Borders representative in the United States is quite alarmed, saying it's an absolute blow to the freedom of press, given the revocation of the press pass for CNN's chief White House correspondent.
Right, Jim Acosta. Yeah, no, and we have at the Society of Professional Journalists, we have issued a statement about that, requesting the White House reinstate Mr. Acosta's credentials, as have other groups in the U.S. It is a serious issue. The White House has the authority to issue these press credentials, but these actions should not be taken punitively because the administration does not like a particular line of questioning.
Alex Tarquinio in Paris.